we are honored to have Mr. Nick Wilson, uh, Senior Director for Gun Violence Prevention at the Center for American Progress, where he leads the organization's efforts to reduce gun violence and shrink the footprint of the criminal justice system while improving public health and safety. Before joining the Center for American Progress, Wilson was the Associate Director of Policy Planning and Coordination at the Baltimore City Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. In addition to researching gun violence at nonprofits in Los Angeles and New York, he was the Executive Director of States United to Prevent Gun Violence and the Maine Gun Safety Coalition. Wilson earned a degree in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I'll leave you now with Mr. Nick Wilson.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. Really appreciated that wonderful opening by Alex. It's always wonderful, whether it's one-on-one or seeing you in the news or these presentations. I always learn something new. And as always, thank you for doing a great job of presenting the latest and most important research. And it's an honor at CAP for us to be in a unique situation where we create some original research. We do a lot of translational research, and we try to emphasize being a little bit less of a traditional think tank where we sit and write 100-page reports, which we have one coming out in a few weeks. That's 30 pages. That started at 100 pages. But we also try to make sure that we're part of the conversation, more of an action tank that's able to really influence what's happening in DC, what's happening in state houses, what's happening in mayor's offices, and especially with things like community violence intervention, which Alex introduced, trying to make sure we get as much federal dollars we can to the local community where we know it's going to do the most good. So I'm going to build off of what Alex presented and talk a bit about gun legislation, some homicide trends we're seeing, and kind of how to talk about public safety in a holistic way. So I got some slides. Great. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. So Center for American Progress, we just turned 20 years old. This is our leader, Patrick Gaspard, who came from the Obama administration and Open Society Foundation, and has been long involved in progressive politics. So as I said, we're not just trying to present policy solutions, but we're also trying to change the country for the better. So I'm going to take us back to 2020, when fear of violent crime and the narrative started really changing. And we saw the erosion of kind of this bipartisan support for criminal justice reform, because when gun violence and other violent crime starts to spike, people sometimes stop believing the research or get concerned about the politics and try to change the conversation about public safety, even though, as Alex discussed, we've been seeing, especially since, the 90s, we've been really at a low for violent crime. But let's go back to 2020. We're all locked at home, and all of us had a cultural moment. For some reason, we decided all to watch Tiger King. We're baking our own bread, trying to hoard some toilet paper. Unfortunately, a lot of people were waiting in line to buy firearms and guns. And what was interesting is, for a long time, we would talk numbers like this. There was this many guns sold. There was this many background checks. And for a while, the surveys were suggesting that it was people buying their 7th gun, their 8th gun, their 15th gun, people that were stockpiling or collecting, or just looking for the latest kind of, they would call it a toy. Obviously, I wouldn't call it that. But people were scared. There was this change in the social dynamic. There's kind of a breakdown in a lot of community. People were fearful. As we learned throughout the year, we started seeing a really kind of unprecedented, very quick spike, where we saw nearly a 30% increase in murders in 2020. When we were trapped at home, we saw especially some big spikes in domestic violence. That was very concerning, and it was very hard to provide services when people were at many times locked at home with their abusers, who were increasingly armed with firearms. So the big headlines we were seeing across the country was fueled by gun violence, cities are breaking all-time homicide records this year. So here at Center for American Progress, we were talking to senators up for re-election, mayors, governors, and they're just like, how do we talk about this? What should we do? So it's very interesting to be a part of those conversations. We did a lot of polling about how people thought about what people thought was happening, what they thought the best solutions were, right? Some of the best messaging. It was really fascinating to see in real time how people were discussing public safety in their communities. What we realized is people were increasingly recognizing the role of firearms as a public safety threat. People still, they supported their local law enforcement department. They wanted to see accountability, but they also understood that there's only so much a mayor can do when gun laws are set at the state and federal level. There's a thing called preemption, where the gun lobby went state to state, and in almost every state said, local mayors, if you're in a big city, if you're in Austin or Houston, and you're the people living there are very concerned about gun violence, they should be able to set their own laws. And it's kind of a conservative principle of home rule or local control, that a one size doesn't fit all. But recognizing that gun violence laws are super popular and bipartisan, the gun lobby and NRA went to each state and said, all right, gun laws can only be written at the state level, which are usually a little bit more conservative and a little bit more easily for the gun lobby to influence. So we took on that messaging, and we're telling mayors, like, first you have to acknowledge the fears that people have, and that everybody deserves to feel safe regardless of who they are. And it's important to acknowledge that. People, especially people on the left, or sometimes will do like, well, actually, it was more dangerous in the 90s, and be dismissive of people's concerns and fears. And we realized that's not what people want to hear. It's not reassuring. And again, any level of violence is too much, and we should take them seriously because of the real impacts on individuals, on families, on communities. And so we really, when people were getting beat up, saying, you're soft on crime, or you need to be tougher, you need longer penalties, you need to throw more money at things that we know haven't been working. We really said, like, acknowledge your fears, talk about a holistic solution, but really go on the offensive and build on that already innate connection between fear of crime with the weak gun laws and the panic buying of firearms. So we, this is very simplistic messaging. We had a lot more nuance, but pretty much saying, like, don't listen to the extremists. It's weak gun laws are to blame. We need to take action. The weak gun laws hurt children and teenagers. Homicide rates are going up. There's more mass shootings in states with weak gun laws. Police officers are more likely to be fatally shot in states with weaker gun laws, and they're less able to solve crimes and hold people accountable. And so if elected officials are serious about reducing violent crime, they must strengthen gun laws and invest in prevention. And this needs to be part of any public safety agenda. And investing in prevention is something that Alex also alluded to, that, we used to just say strengthen gun laws, but I think it's equally important to know that, we need to strengthen our gun laws. We need to go upstream and hold bad actors accountable, whether it's gun manufacturers, gun dealers that are breaking the law, whether it's the people that are straw purchasing and buying guns without background checks and selling them. Like, we need to hold those people accountable, focus less on holding someone accountable who's just carrying a gun for self-defense that maybe lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. And for those folks, we need to really invest to put our money where our mouth is on prevention, and whether that's community violence intervention programs, or it's the greening and cleaning, and other ways to really look at the gun violence problem and invest in victim services, invest in domestic violence services, in sexual assault treatment, all those things. And so this really resonated. We used our research to really dig down on how weak gun laws are impacting all people from across the country. We talked about how weak gun laws increase female gun homicide rates. how it disproportionately hurts communities of color. We did some interesting research on the Hispanic community, which doesn't always get as much attention as maybe the African American community, but it's gun violence is one of the top three things that are motivating Hispanic voters when they go to the ballot box. And we need to make sure that we're speaking directly to them and making sure that we're proposing solutions that make sense to them. And so here's an example. So from about 2022, leading up to the midterms, we worked a lot on making this connection and providing the data that can be used to change the narrative around gun violence. And again, really trying to encourage lawmakers not to do what's easy and repeat tough on crimes talking points that people of both parties kind of fall back into when they're not presented with a polling and data informed, effective and thoughtful public messaging strategy. Because what mayors and governors and elected officials and the media says really matters and really changes the perception of what is the problem and what are the solutions. So we're very proud that we were able to kind of neutralize a weakness around criminal justice and public safety. And really, I was much more involved, and the gun violence prevention team was much more involved because of that connection that voters have between weak gun laws and lack of public safety. So then things really started to change in 2023. We were going back to the movies. We were getting out of our homes a lot more. Kind of things were seeming to feel like a little bit back to normal. And very happily, we were seeing that gun violence really started to trend down in 2023. I'll be presenting some research from my colleague Chandler, who's on my team, who's been doing some really great quantitative work and really drilling down at the state and city level. And really excited that we're also with Professor Picaro kind of going to be doing some forthcoming research that's kind of looking back at the early days of the pandemic, really trying to test some theories about what was happening, what were the causes, and also test our theory that stronger gun laws really were a protective factor. Because following an alarming national spike in violent crime over the first 2 years of the pandemic, in 2023, we saw the largest one-year decline in murder rates in modern U.S. history. This is something that really needs to be celebrated, and we need to make sure people know this. I live in Baltimore, and I talk to my friends, and we could feel the difference. People are walking out more at night. People aren't carrying their pepper spray as much. They're not looking over their shoulders as much. Like it feels different, but sometimes perceptions really lag, and people, as I'll show, people get their information from interesting sources and social media and the news. And so we really wanted to kind of dig into this and see what was happening. And what we learned is that this remarkable drop really did happen, but it wasn't felt evenly across the country. And we saw that states with the weakest gun laws really saw the least progress in 2023. And they really kind of seems to be confirming our thesis that if we want to avoid needless death and devastation, like our nation already experienced, keeps experiencing, that we need to follow the data and pass stronger gun laws and invest in prevention. And so, majority of U.S. cities saw historic declines in 2023. But again, we're an increasingly divided country, and I don't just mean politically. So let's look at the 2023 state trends, and then we'll zero in on cities, because people really think of gun violence and homicides and violent crime as more of a localized issue. So again, there was a historic drop in 2023, 12%. We're still waiting for official FBI data, but using gun violence archive data, going and looking at official city data kind of one by one, or building off of the work of folks like Jeff Asher, we were able to see that this double-digit decline in murder rate happened, and gun homicides were down 7.7% year over year. And then what we did is we looked at the 300 largest U.S. cities And we used Gifford's scorecard, who does Gifford's gun violence prevention organization. They do a great job of every year looking to see what the gun laws are and kind of the investments in prevention and giving them a score, A, B, C, D, F. And we really looked at the cities and the states with the strongest gun laws, those A's, A minuses, and then the F's. And we really started to see the stark disparity. So of the 300 largest US cities, cities and states with the strongest gun laws experienced 19.4% fewer gun homicides in 2023. 19.4%. That's enormous. That's huge. That's unprecedented. But cities and states with the weakest gun laws, with these F grades, they saw a decline, but only 5.1%. They really weren't getting the same public safety gains and that other cities were in those states. And so we saw marginal improvements to public safety, if any. So digging down, you can see the map. It's actually interactive. If you go to our website, you can check out how your state did and compare it to others. You know, it was interesting to see how people use this. You know, the Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, you know, they were very happy that Pennsylvania had this, was the state that had the second largest percentage decline. And that was something that they would talk about publicly, you know, showing their commitment to tackling the gun violence prevention issue. So we saw 36 states saw their gun rate decrease. So again, not all states, but a majority, a healthy majority. And then when we look at this, again, the ones with the strongest gun laws and then the weakest gun laws, that's where we saw a lot of difference. We saw a 13.7% decrease there. You can also, as you can see, you can look at the full chart on our website, but you can see in absolute numbers that there was a lot of decline across the country. Of the 14 states that saw increased gun homicide rates, so the ones that were trending in the opposite direction, half of them had a rating of a D- or lower. Only 2 had an A-, and no state had a rating of an A. And so again, we're not trying to overstate causation, but we did see this correlation. There's still some noise in there and anomalies, but the trends we thought are pretty persuasive and pretty consistent in previous and forthcoming research. You know, Massachusetts, Hawaii, and Rhode Island, you know, didn't have the biggest declines and had some increases. But I think it's notable that those are states that already have some of the lowest rates of gun homicides in the country. So it's maybe not a surprise that we didn't see this massive drop because they already were at very low rates. Massachusetts and Hawaii, they do have the strongest gun laws in the country. And Massachusetts is also, you know, it's great to have strong gun laws at the state level, but you're also influenced by the states surrounding you. So for example, you know, Massachusetts has strong gun laws, but it's also surrounded by states that also have strong gun laws, maybe not as strong, but strong. And so it's harder to go to the next state over and buy a gun without a background check if you have to go many more states over to find a state with weak gun laws. Hawaii is also benefits because it's an island, so it makes purchasing and trafficking a lot more difficult when you have to get on a plane or a boat. And again, Rhode Island, we just talked to Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence, and they passed a stronger safe storage bill in the Senate recently, and they're strengthening their gun laws. So I'm expecting to see some progress there. And then of the 10 cities that saw the largest declines in gun homicide rates, 7 are in states with a grade of A- or higher. So just different ways of kind of saying the same point, but showing the consistency that the strength of gun laws in a state really did seem to matter. All right, let's go into the cities for 2023. Of the 10 cities that saw the largest increases in gun homicide rates, 7 are in states with a Giffords grade of F-. And so talking about I know. So I was saying that we're kind of a divided country, not just politically. What really seems to be happening is there hasn't been much action at the federal level until recently. There was the Bipartisan Safer Community Act that did a lot, but there didn't tackle some of the biggest loopholes in our gun laws. So really, it's still at the state level, and we're seeing states like I mentioned, Rhode Island and California, that already have pretty good gun laws or strengthening them, and then we have states like Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Ohio. They're moving in the opposite direction. They don't have very many gun laws, and the few that they have on the books, they're actually trying to repeal or successfully repealing. And so these states, they pass permitless carry laws, meaning that someone can, not before you had to go do a background check, before you could carry a gun everywhere with you. Maybe you had to prove that you've fired a gun before, prove that you know the laws, maybe do a fingerprinting, just kind of basic things that make it a little bit harder for people that are legally prohibited from carrying a firearm from being able to, and make it easier for law enforcement to trace a gun and close cases when someone uses the firearm to commit violence. And so, it's unfortunate that on one side of America, people are investing in prevention and opening offices of gun violence prevention. They're doing safe storage. They're doing red flag laws. They're strengthening background checks and safe storage. And on the other side of America, elected officials are continuing to buy the gun lobby lie that more guns make us safer, and they continue to put politics over people. And so we used our research to really do a lot of translational research, showing exactly how dangerous it is to let almost anyone carry a concealed handgun in public. It increases violent crime, firearm robberies, gun thefts, workplace homicides, mass shootings. It makes it harder for law enforcement to prevent and solve crimes. We quoted law enforcement from all across the country, all political ideologies, who were very concerned and upset about states like Georgia removing one of the most important tools law enforcement has to make sure that guns aren't in the hands of people that shouldn't have them. And so, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that removing these concealed carry permit systems, which now a majority of states in the country do not require a permit, they're associated with higher rates of gun homicide and violent crime. And then last year in 2023, Illinois passed an assault weapons ban. New York increased access to victim compensation services for gun violence survivors. Maryland, after many tries, finally requires gun owners to secure their firearms around children to prevent suicides, school shootings, mass shootings, and unintentional shootings. One of the other things we learned in 2023 is that elections really matter. In 2023, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz signed key gun bills, and we called them kind of foundational gun bills, policies like background checks and red flags that really you need to have before you start doing other more specific gun bills. We say background checks are such a foundational that if you don't have background checks, it's really hard to have other gun laws, because you can prohibit all these different types of people, from domestic abusers to people with certain violent misdemeanors from getting guns. But if they can just go to a Walmart parking lot and buy a gun, no questions asked, and cash, those laws aren't going to be super effective. And so it was, one more example, Colorado saw a 19% reduction in gun homicides last year. And that was just huge. But rather than become complacent, the state legislature doubled down and passed additional life-saving laws, like raising the minimum age to purchase guns, enacting waiting periods, increasing access to justice for survivors. And Colorado was the most improved state on Gifford's gun laws ranking, moving from a B to an A-. Conversely, Mississippi, they had a 13% increase in gun homicides in 2023. And yet the legislature, instead of taking this seriously, they passed more dangerous gun laws, incentivizing teachers to carry guns in schools, and preventing law enforcement agencies or any agencies from maintaining any kind of gun records, making it very difficult to hold people accountable. And then, mentioning cities, we saw this disparity deepen even more in cities, where some cities established local offices of gun violence prevention. Even though the White House created one last year, and then leverage federal funds to invest in community violence intervention programs. So cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, New York, Philly, they all invested heavily in violence prevention, and they all had double-digit declines in 2023. And so there was an interesting correlation there, and we're looking forward to digging a little bit deeper and seeing if the trend continues and if there's some causal links that we can make. It is important to note that gun violence was still higher in 2023 than before the pandemic, and that there are significant threats to these hard-fought gains. Our extreme right-wing Supreme Court could roll back critical state and federal gun laws that have protected American lives for decades. We're really thinking a lot about one of the most important federal laws is being able to disarm domestic abusers. And the Rahimi case before the Supreme Court right now could put all people, but especially women and children, at much greater risk. They're even looking at, maybe we should not regulate machine guns and make them a little bit easier for people to get, or tasers. So there's a lot going on. And so we're really looking at states like California, encouraging people to follow their lead, where they were able to, they're knowing there's a dangerous fiscal cliff coming with ARPA money, American Rescue Plan Act, that are using being used by all these cities to prop up these Office of Violence Prevention and to make sure that they can expand their violence prevention programs. But that money's going to kind of come to an end in a couple of years. And so California added a tax on ammunition and firearms, that some of it will go to law enforcement and some of it will go to these violence prevention. And so we're seeing that trend happen at the state level too. So we need to find sustainable ways to double down on this success. So I'm going to fast forward now to the present, 2024. A lot of us were listening to the Beyonce album when it first dropped. Some of us are Swifties, I didn't forget you, but we're feeling back in a national conversation about music and seeing live music and feeling a little bit better, hopefully, because violent crime is dropping fast in the US. As this NPR headline shows, though, not all Americans really believe it. And then we're seeing this happen in cities like New Orleans that have been, having some of the highest crime and violent crime for years, and we're seeing some real decreases. So we talked about this a little bit earlier today, so I won't belabor the point. But here are, from 2016 up to 2024, you can see the spikes happening during the pandemic. You could see it kind of leveling out. And now you can see this really impressive decline from 2023 and now also for 2024. So this is gun victimization. These are homicides and non-fatal shootings. So it's easier to get murder data. As Alex mentioned, it's really hard to get non-fatal shooting data. But the Gun Violence Archive and some cities that report on it and collect on it were able to get some data. Mass shootings also on the decline, maybe not happening quite as quickly. There's a few reasons for that. We can talk about that later. And so what we did is, we know that public opinion changes quickly, people's attitudes change. So we decided to go back out and do some more polling. I think polling in public safety, and especially gun violence movement, is severely lacking compared to other advocacy movements. So we were trying to just get a sense of what was happening. And so our research kind of has been showing kind of over time that although categories of crime are declining, voters actually believe it's increasing. And that actually more people now think that crime is up a lot than when it actually was up, looking at kind of from a quantitative and historic viewpoint. And so we asked about crime in general, and we also specifically asked about gun violence, because we noticed in our last polling that gun violence was something that people really wanted to talk about and resonated with folks. I thought this was an interesting outcome. We were asking people like that who thinks it's going up, like, well, what makes you say that? Like, where are you getting your information from? And so a lot of it from news stories, some from social media. Some of them will say they'll get it from statistics, probably their local statistics. Not many from their elected officials talking about it, which you can either get the message that maybe that's not the best messengers, or for me, I think that maybe elected officials aren't talking about it enough. And I know it's an election year, there's a lot of competing priorities and demands, but public safety and gun violence continue to be one of the most motivating factors for voters. So it's something that people need to be talking about. I know this is a very busy slide, so I won't spend much time here, but it's interesting that people generally feel safer in their own neighborhoods, where they think crime is increasing in their city or around the country or kind of other places. And we see that it's pretty consistent amongst demographics. There's some differences in white voters definitely feel safer, but interesting to see some of the parity between Republicans and Democrats. And actually, it's interesting to see rural people saying that they feel pretty safe. One of the narratives we pushed back against is that during the pandemic, gun violence was a city problem and not a rural problem. We actually looked at the most dangerous counties in the country per capita, and most of them were in the rural South. One, feel bad for KFF. They saw that we chose Phillips County, Arkansas. What we saw was the most dangerous place, and sent a reporter out there to see what was going on over there. And it was not a wonderful staycation, to say the least, over there. And so this is an issue that's really affecting everybody, rural, suburban, and in cities. All right. I'm very excited. Chandler on my team was crunching some numbers to get us the most up-to-date numbers for this presentation and for our forthcoming research. And so I'm going to show some data that's current for as of the end of April. So as of just a few days ago, again, using gun violence archive data. So there's always a little bit of adjustments later, but this is a pretty good snapshot of what's going on. And in addition to our polling, Pew Research did some January 2024 polling and saw that concerns about crime are growing among Republicans and Democrats, even as crime is declining. And as you can see, looking at the 50 largest U.S. cities, the ones on the top in red have seen increases in gun violence, both homicides and non-fatal shootings. But the vast majority of the large cities are seeing significant declines, and the trends that I mentioned earlier seem to be continuing. So you can look a little bit in here. Some cities that are, in Colorado and California definitely are increasing. Kansas City, you'll remember there was anyways, there's been some issues there, but yeah, you start to see, look at how impressive some of these numbers are with Philadelphia, Baltimore, where I live, Columbus, Detroit, really seeing these significant decreases. And so we'll have, by the end of the month, we'll have an interactive map where you can kind of sort and look at your cities and look at the states. But we're very excited to see these trends. And so these are kind of just some preliminary forthcoming information. Gun violence is down in the majority of large US cities. 75 of the largest 100 US cities and 40 of the 50 largest US cities experienced the same or fewer gun violence victimizations in 2024 compared to 2023. So again, that's when I say majority of large US cities, it's not just 50%, it's 75% are seeing the same or more likely declines. Again, overall, gun homicide and victimization rates are still higher than the pre-pandemic levels, which is, some folks, that's their benchmark. For us, pre-pandemic levels are still far too high, but it's, I think, important for narratives and kind of understanding what's happening. And some of those cities I mentioned, plus Jacksonville, Florida, and Charlotte, they were actually among 30 of the 50 largest US cities that actually do have lower gun violence rates this year in 2024 so far than in 2019. So that's really exciting. Those are going to not just pre-pandemic levels, but maybe setting kind of new records for all-time lows in places like Baltimore. One thing to note is, we're timing the release of this research because we want to change and influence narratives and get people's attention. A lot of times, folks like us will have really interesting research, and even if it's not behind a paywall of a journal, even if we put it out with a press release, it might get gobbled up by the news of the day. But it's a well-known trend that gun violence and homicides and violent crime, there's an uptick in the summer months. And so that means there's usually a media narrative happening at the end of May, early June, saying, are we going to, it's down now, but are we going to see a spike? And so we're really curious to be monitoring real time the trends that happen this summer. So we're going to move away from that kind of data for a little bit. I know that was a lot, but I think for a lot of us, that was very exciting data. And I kind of just want to preview something else that I mentioned is one of our long reports that's coming out later this month. We've been spending maybe a year on this really interesting, what we're calling an accountability and prevention framework. So when I mentioned we were doing the polling in 2021 and 2022, we felt like we're really on defense. We knew that because crime was up and the narrative, people were saying like, oh, kids these days, the youth are out of control, and things like carjackings that are very scary for a lot of people, and especially for people that maybe aren't used to worrying about violence in their neighborhood, having their car stolen and taken from them violently is something that really changes fears. And unfortunately, the data wasn't really backing up that this was a youth violence problem, but we were seeing this painful rhetoric, and so we really felt like we were on the defensive, saying like, no, don't kind of play into those narratives. Don't throw people under the bus. We know what works. Let's not change course. But we realized that it was really unsatisfying as an organization that really has strong values and beliefs in making a more safe and just world for everybody, regardless of income, ability, what community you're from, whether it's the LGBTQI or African American or Latino community. And so we really, AAPI, it's something we've really been focusing a lot. There were really significant fears around crime and hate crimes at that time, but we really wanted to say, all right, let's not stop talking about what we're against. Let's start talking about what we're for, and let's present a proactive public safety agenda. And it's easy to write a long report with a laundry list of progressive solutions, and we've done that before, and we're working with partners that do that. But we know that a lot of elected officials aren't going to read those reports, and even getting a staffer to do that is difficult. And they're going to be like, well, that's not really relevant to the conversation in my community. So we used the polling and using experts across CAP to really come up with a meaningful way to talk about and actually put policies in place that will make our community safer. And we realized that we call it accountability and prevention because we realized that if you just talk about prevention, voters will maybe perceive you as soft on crime. They won't think you're taking things seriously. But then if you only talk about accountability, if you only talk about the role of police and prosecutors, then you're alienating a lot of folks, and you're missing the opportunity to reinforce the message that moving upstream and holding people accountable and investing in housing and medical treatment and victim services, repairing harm to victims and crime survivors, like that has to be part of the conversation too. And so we're ensuring that here's our accountability slide. We're also trying to redefine accountability. It doesn't just mean lock people up and throw away the key with longer sentences. It really means holding the system and agencies accountable and thinking of ways to do restorative justice and repairing harm that is not just based off of just longer sentences. And then also just more collaboration with the community and being more responsive. And then we also suggest investing in prevention. And so you'll see that so these are just examples of 4 gun laws that the gun violence prevention movement has kind of coalesced around. Maybe one that's a little bit different. You hear a lot about background checks. Research shows that background checks are necessary, but not sufficient. A couple of states, when a state passes background checks, it's helpful, but because of other kind of loopholes, difficult to enforce, you can go to nearby states without them. it's really not sufficient. And so we recommend a stronger version of background checks called permit to purchase. They are extremely effective. From Johns Hopkins University has some really great research on the effectiveness of permit to purchase laws. And then extreme risk protection order laws. I think those are one of the more mainstream ones that people really talk about. They're commonly known as red flag laws. We were really trying to push back against them being called that as a movement, but we lost that. And we kind of now will interchangeably call them ERPOs, which don't really roll off the tongue, but also red flag laws. And then child access prevention and safe storage laws. For every school shooting, the gun has to come from somewhere, and it's usually a parent or a friend has left it unsecured. And then a big one right now is focusing less on individual accountability, which is a lot of whack-a-mole and is what we've been doing for so long, and it really hasn't been working as much as people would like. We really need to hold the gun industry accountable. There are simple measures that they can do to stop selling guns to gun dealers that they know are selling them illegally without paperwork out the back door, or basic safety mechanisms. So that way, if someone so often you'll hear about a child, usually a child, sometimes an adult, taking out the magazine or the of a gun, maybe to clean it or show it to someone, and they forgot that there's one in the chamber. And this happens all the time. And there's a simple technology that's been around for 100 years that if you take out the magazine, then you can't fire the gun with the one in the chamber. But there's no incentive to do that because of this thing called PLCA, where the gun industry was able to get Congress to write in a very special exemption that, unlike every other maker of consumer goods, is very hard to sue them for negligence. It's not impossible. Some people think it is, and we don't want them to think that, but they do have very broad exemptions. And you'll know that, gun violence is the leading cause of death for children. Gun deaths have surpassed car deaths. And part of that is because cars have gotten a lot safer because people suing and people doing airbags and safety mechanisms to survive a crash. But we haven't seen any of that innovation in the gun industry because there's no incentives. And unfortunately, in this country, lawsuits are one of the ways that we get change done. We're also going to have a lot of research on how to expand the public safety workforce. We want law enforcement to focus on what no one else can do, which is solve homicides and non-fatal shootings, build strong cases, and hold accountable the very small number of people in our communities that are driving violence. But we don't need them responding to every mental health call or doing traffic enforcement. And we need to, and especially with community violence intervention, there's certain neighborhoods and public housing and places that they can't operate. But these credible messengers that come from those communities, they have a license to operate in those areas and are able to gather information, provide resources, and provide messages of anti-violence to try to prevent retaliatory shootings, or something that's increasingly something that happened on Instagram or social media that will then lead to real life violence. And also that, we need to intervene. Intervention and prevention are different. Intervention is who's at the highest risk of being involved, either as a perpetrator or victim of gun violence right now. And that's constantly changing. How do we reach that small number of people with targeted resources and messages of deterrence and support? But then we do need to go upstream and focus on prevention. And that's like what Alex talked about, the kind of the parks and rec, and getting lead out of paint in the water and increasing economic opportunities. So we're going to have some very long reports, but we know that we get maybe 2 minutes of a public official's attention before their eyes kind of glaze over on charts and graphs. And same thing with social media. Our attention spans are decreasing, myself included. So we've been really leaning into storytelling and digital storytelling, and seeing my face a lot less, and really centering the voices of survivors and people on the front lines doing this work. And so I'm really proud of the videos that we've done. We just released, I think, our 13th community violence intervention video yesterday, as well as we've been sharing great resources on, how to talk to survivors of gun violence, what maybe to say or not to say, or letting gun violence survivors who've been in horrific mass shootings, school shootings, community violence, police violence, tell their story to lawmakers directly and ask for what would make them feel safer. And then we've also so we have two series, one about survivors speaking. We did one on Columbine recently with a Columbine survivor that got a lot of views, that was really shared a lot during the Columbine 20th anniversary. And then we also have a lot of videos of success stories. Chris Edge here is becoming a friend of mine through this project. He was shot, then later he was stabbed 12 times by someone in a mental health crisis that was his friend, then he was shot again. But because of a hospital-based violence interruption program, we don't say it saved him. It's not, there's no savior complex here. It's they were there when he needed it and provided the resources and were constant. And now he's meeting with the president and speaking at our conference, and he's a rapper in South DC, and really turning his near-death experiences into just remarkable advocacy and storytelling. And just my last note, one city I didn't mention is DC, that really has, because lawmakers are here, because there's a lot of media here, it really has an outsized influence on the crime narratives, just like New York City. And DC has been really struggling with public safety, and but it's almost all localized to kind of South DC and the poorer parts, where DC's been gentrifying so much and growing so much, getting so expensive. But we've really been, and instead of investing more and more into the people that really need it, that have been here and are suffering from disinvestment, there's this increased movement to cut all funding, or a lot of funding, to the violence interrupters that are putting their life on the line, instead giving it to other programs that doesn't work. And so this is an honor to really be survivor-centered and focused in our, not just publicly with our videos, but also making sure that they're at the table when we decide what our priorities are on the Hill, in DC, and in state houses and locally. So that's my time. I talked a lot. I'm excited to answer questions later on a panel, but I really appreciate everyone for your attention and looking at our resources.
Wow, Nick, bravo! What a wonderful presentation. Thank you for coming equipped with all this data, and for reminding us that, like what we like to say at the Institute, we believe firmly that violence is preventable, and that if we follow the science, if we do what is known to work, we will get the results. And now your presentation really tells us that we had to go beyond political will to do some of the things and find, workable strategies to get the message to be consumed by the people that we want to implement them. But